So our dilemma, as usual, is I always pick a topic that's much too large. So we will speak quickly. I wanted to do something in honor of the 50th anniversary of the reunification of Jerusalem. So I decided to speak about some memorable women of Jerusalem from 76 BCE until 1948. That's a small topic. I purposely did not start in the biblical period because if we started in the biblical period, we would never proceed to any other period. And what I did in the end is I chose two women from the late Second Temple period and one woman from the 19th century and one woman from the 20th century. And if you say, why didn't I choose so-and-so, it's because how many people can you fit into 1 hour? But I think that these four women each had an impact or each is a type of woman who had contact with Jerusalem during the past 2,100 years. And I think each of the four stories is very, very interesting, and we could easily spend an hour on every one of these figures. The first is Shlamtzion HaMalka, and as Dr. Edka Leibowitz stresses in her doctorate and to me this morning, the original name was Shlamtzion and not Shlomtzion. And Yosef Klausner decided some 80 years ago that her name was Shlomtzion, and that is why the street is called Shlamtzion HaMalka. But in all of the ancient sources, she is called Shlamtzion and not Shlomtzion. The difference being that Shalom is Aramaic and Shalom is Hebrew. But of course, you can't fight City Hall. She's going to remain Shlomtzion forever. The only Jewish queen other than Queen Esther in Jewish history, more or less. The second figure is Martha Bat Baitus, who is a tragic figure associated with the destruction of the Second Temple, which is appropriate for this time of year because we're coming on to the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. The third woman no one has ever heard of. She was a simple woman who lived in Jerusalem in the late 19th century. And she is typical of many Haredi, ultra-Orthodox women who moved to Israel and viewed this land as a holy land without any intent of forming a modern state or anything of that nature. And finally, we have a Giborah, a heroine, named Esther Kalingold or Tselingold, who made Aliyah, lived here for a year and a half, and was killed as a heroine in the War of Independence. So after that short introduction, let us plunge into the topic. So Queen Alexandra, as she was called in Greek sources, or Shlamtzion HaMalka, as she is called in Jewish sources, was the only woman who reigned during the Hasmonean period. She was the wife of Alexander Yanai. When he died in 76 BCE, rather than appoint one of his sons as his successor, Aristobulus or Hyrcanus, he appointed his wife as his successor. Apparently the reason was that he thought that his wife was more qualified to reign than they were, which in retrospect was probably true. There was a lot of court intrigue among the Hasmonean kings of that period, infighting, killing each other, betraying each other, and so on and so forth. He thought that his wife would behave in a more responsible fashion, which I think she did. And indeed, she died in 67 BCE. Just a few short years later, Palestine, the land of Israel, was conquered by the Romans in 63 before the Common Era. It could be that one of the reasons for that was the infighting among her sons after she died. Dr. Edka Leibowitz devoted her doctoral thesis to Queen Alexandra. This was just finished in 2011. And since then, Edka has published a series of articles on Shlomtzion. I'm basing myself on her doctorate and on those articles. Basically, most of what we know from Josephus Flavius, who was, of course, the central historian of the late Second Temple period. And as you may know, Josephus had his biases and his subjective way of writing history, which was very, very common at that time. Perhaps it's still common today. There's no such thing as objective history. And as many people, well, before we get to Josephus, I want to look at two Talmudic sources, which I Xeroxed for you, or three Talmudic sources. If you look at page number 3, I Xeroxed this from Edka's doctorate because she conveniently gathered all the rabbinic sources about Shlamtzion HaMalkah. And one thing we can say for certain, which is that the rabbis of the Talmud and Midrash really liked Shlamtzion HaMalkah. They have nothing but good things to say about her. And three of the sources are in front of you on page 3 of the handout. The first one is from Sifra Bechukotai. Sifra is the Tanaitic Midrash, the Midrash of the Tanaim on the book of Leviticus, on the book of Vayikra. They quote the verse, V'natati gishmechem bi'itan, and I shall give you rain in its season. Bileilot Shabbat, that the rain will always fall on Friday nights. Why? Because then it doesn't bother anyone. Everybody's at home. Maaseh bimei Shimon ben Shetach ubimei Shlamtzu. You notice that that's what she's called in this source, not Shlamtzion, but Shlamtzu. Hamalka, Shayu Geshamim Yordim Milelei Shabbat Lelei Shabbat, that the rains only fell on Friday nights. Ad shenasu chitim keklayot useorim kegarinei zetim ve'adashim kedinarei zahav. There's a little bit of exaggeration here, that the agriculture was so successful at that period of time of Shimon ben Shetach, who was the leader of the Pharisees at that time, and Shlamtzion HaMalkah, that the grains of wheat were the size of kidneys, the grains of barley were the size of olive pits, and the lentils were the size of gold dinarim. And the next source is very similar, Sifrei Dvarim, also a Tanaitic Midrash on the book of Dvarim. Rabbi Natan says, Bi'ito, you shall have rain in its season. Milelei Shabbat lelei Shabbat, kederach shiardu bimei Shlamtzu HaMalkah. Here he doesn't give any credit to Shimon ben Shetach, but only to Shlamtzion HaMalkah. And then in Leviticus Rabbah, Vayikra Rabbah, which is a later source, which is at the bottom of the page, Maaseh bimei Shimon ben Shetach ubimei Shlamtzion HaMalkah, shayu agshamim yordim milelei Shabbat lelei Shabbat, etc., etc. So in these three rabbinic sources, two from the 2nd century and one, I would say, more from the 4th century. They say that this was a golden age, at least from an agricultural point of view, and they credit this to Shimon ben Shetach, the leader of the Pharisees, and Shlamtzion HaMalkah, the queen of the Jewish people. This is typical of all the rabbinic sources about Shlamtzion HaMalkah. They loved her. Now we'll go over to Josephus. And Josephus, as I said, if we had time, we could spend, I did not Xerox Josephus for you because it's too long. But if you want to look up the sources yourself, they're listed on the first page. Milchamot HaYudim, the Wars of the Jews, Book 1, paragraphs 107 to 119. And Kadmoniot HaYudim, the Jewish Antiquities by Josephus, Book 13, paragraphs 399 to 432. And I listed one Hebrew version and one English version of these works. Of course, Josephus wrote in Greek, which is Greek to me, but there are a number of different Hebrew translations and a number of different English translations. In the Wars of the Jews, Josephus says, now Alexander left the kingdom to Alexandra his wife, and depended that the Jews would now very readily submit to her. And he goes on to say, nor was he mistaken as to his expectations, for this woman kept the dominion by the opinion that the people had of her piety. In other words, she was a fromma Yid. She was a pious Jew, for she chiefly studied the ancient customs of her country and cast those men out of the government that offended against their holy laws. In other words, she is portrayed. What? Where is she now? I don't know. Would we really want the religious parties to rule the state of Israel? I'm not so sure. In other words, in Wars of the Jews, Josephus depicts her as a very pious woman. And he says that she worked in very good relations with the Pharisees, and now the Pharisees join themselves to her to assist her in government. Now Alexandra hearkened to them to an extraordinary degree, as being herself a woman of great piety towards God. I'm skipping in the section. She was a sagacious woman in the management of great affairs, and intent always upon gathering soldiers together, so that she increased the army the one half, and procured a great body of foreign troops. In other words, not only did she get along with the Pharisees and was she very frum, but she increased the army by 50%. Then he has a little bit of a dig. While she governed other people, the Pharisees governed her. And he goes on to say that she sent out her army to Damascus, and she got possession of Damascus. Today we would say, who in the world wants Damascus? She also prevailed with Tigranes, king of Armenia, who had a huge amount of soldiers, and she basically bribed him to go away and not attack the land of Israel. And then at the end of the section, she fell sick. Aristobulus, her younger son, used this as an opportunity to take control of affairs. He got possession of all the fortresses, and Alexandra died before she could punish Aristobulus for disinheriting his brother after she had reigned for 9 years. So the account in the Wars of the Jews is very brief, but basically very, very positive vis-a-vis Alexandra, as Josephus calls her. The account in the Jewish Antiquities is much longer. It's in the English translation of William Whiston from the 1700s. It's 4 pages long. I'm certainly not going to read this to you. And what confused historians, which Etka Leibowitz deals with in her doctorate, is the fact that basically in the account in the Antiquities of the Jews, he also has a positive attitude towards her. He talks about her frumkeit, the fact that she was so observant, that she got along with the Pharisees, that she took control of the kingdom. She had many soldiers, many mercenaries working for her. Again, he discusses the story about going to Damascus, of bribing Tigranes, king of Armenia, not to invade the land of Israel, and so on and so forth. And it's all very, very positive until he gets to the end. And I want to read you Dr. Leibowitz's translation of the very end of the passage in Antiquities of the Jews. This is in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 13, paragraphs 417 and 430 to 432. So until you get to the ending, you think, oh, Josephus also loved Alexandra. And this is what he writes at the end. By a woman's raving mad lust for power, not understanding how to act in accordance with her dignity. I'm skipping a section. For she deemed the present state of affairs more important than those of the future, and she regarded all things secondary to possessing the power to rule. Because of this, she did not pay attention to that which is noble nor just. Consequently, she caused misfortune to her dynasty, which had attained sovereignty despite many dangers and difficulties, due to a lust for these things which are not befitting a woman. Not very long afterwards, the sovereignty was taken away from the Judeans because she had agreed with the opinions of those hostile to her family and had left the kingdom bereft of anyone to care for it. And the way in which she governed during her lifetime caused the palace to be filled with both misfortunes and political tumults even after her death. But although she ruled in such a way, she maintained the nation peacefully, which of course contradicts everything he just said. This was the end of Alexandra. So many, many historians have been puzzled by these two accounts of Josephus. Josephus in Wars of the Jews has nothing but praise for Alexandra. Josephus in Antiquities has nothing but praise for Alexandra until he gets to the last 2 paragraphs where he skewers her. So what's going on here? So Dr. Leibowitz in her doctorate and in the article that I read, she brings various theories. For example, one theory is that Josephus in general had a negative opinion of the Hasmonean kings. So since in this case she was a Hasmonean queen, he had to say something negative against her because that was his stereotypical description of Hasmonean kings. I like Dr. Leibowitz's explanation better. The Wars of the Jews was written shortly after Josephus gave himself up to the Roman authorities. If you know the story, he was the general up in Gamla in the Galilee, and he basically betrayed his people. He surrenders, and he moves to Rome, and he writes the Wars of the Jews. And Antiquities was written some 20 years later when he had already been living in Rome for 20 years. So what's the difference? What she says is that in Wars of the Jews, he was still writing as a Hellenistic historian, whereas Antiquities of the Jews, he was writing as a Roman historian. So what's the difference? The difference is in their attitude towards women. In the Hellenistic circles, those writing in the Eastern, in this part of the Hellenistic empire, they basically had a positive attitude towards women, and they had a positive attitude towards women rulers. In Rome, women were supposed to stay at home. The Romans could not imagine that a woman could be a ruler. It went against everything in Roman sociology or in Roman political culture. And therefore, what Dr. Leibowitz suggests, both in her doctorate and in her article, was that in the Wars of the Jews, where everything is very positive towards Alexandra, this was typical of the way Hellenist historians write history. But in the Antiquities of the Jews, where he's already been living in Rome for 20 years, he has already adopted the Roman attitude, which is that women cannot possibly rule. And therefore, even though most of it is similar to the Wars of the Jews and very positive towards Alexandra, when he gets to the end, he has to say, well, she's a woman, she must be a terrible ruler. This is the only explanation that I have found that I think accounts for this contradiction between the two accounts of Josephus Flavius vis-a-vis Queen Alexandra. The last thing I want to say, before moving on to our next historical figure, is that Queen Alexandra is also found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Not in a major way, but she is mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Several Qumran documents mention Alexandra's reign. Calendrical documents 4Q331 and 4Q322. This is the way that Dead Sea Scrolls are numbered. Twice mention Alexandra's Hebrew-Aramaic name, Shlam Tzion. They also indicate that the Qumranites considered her an important historical figure worthy of mention. And then there are a number of other veiled references to Shlam Tzion in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are not particularly positive, but it's also not certain that the Dead Sea Scrolls are referring to her in those other places. In the calendrical documents, they are definitely referring to her by name. They mention Shlam Tzion Hamalka. So we know that she is described at length in the two books of Josephus. She is mentioned briefly in the Dead Sea Scrolls from the late Second Temple period. She is mentioned quite a few times in rabbinic literature. The basic attitude, the basic description of Shlam Tzion or Alexandra is a very positive one. Aside from that ending in Antiquities, which seems to have been affected by Josephus' sojourn in Rome during those 20 years, when he took up the opinion that women cannot possibly be rulers. So that is what I wanted to say about Shlam Tzion al regel achat, on one foot. Any questions or comments about Queen Alexandra? Yes?
I was trying to do the math. She was almost 64, 65 years old.
Yes. She reigned from age 64 to 73. Right? 60, yeah. Yeah, which is a pretty old age at that period of time. But from everything we know, she seemed to do a good job within the framework of the way Hasmonean kings and queens ruled, which was a lot of it we wouldn't really identify with today. A lot of wars, a lot of bloodshed, but that was the way things were run at that time. Yes.
Were there any other queens, Israeli queens, or how did she become a queen?
Well, she became queen because before he died, Alexandriana, her husband, appointed her queen. He decided that she would be a better ruler than the two sons. And again, this fits into the Hellenistic period. Who was her contemporary, a rather famous queen?
Cleopatra.
Cleopatra. right? In other words, in the Hellenistic world, it was not unusual for a queen to rule. So the fact that he chose her and not his two sons was not so unusual within the Hellenistic context. In the Roman context, it was unheard of. Okay, so that is the first historical woman of Jerusalem that I wanted to examine with you. And I think we can say that it's justified that she has a street name for her in Jerusalem, even though the spelling may not be correct. Now we move over to Martha bat Baitus. And she is a tragic figure. You'll see on the second page, I listed some bibliography about her. I listed Josephus, who may be referring to her. I listed the tractate of Gittin and Midrash Hagadol, which we're going to study in a moment. And I listed two Israeli sources, Echa Rabbah and the Yerushalmi, that we are not going to study. And then I listed 3 articles in English and 1 article in Hebrew about Martha bat Baitus. Martha bat Baitus is mentioned in many places in rabbinic literature, which is unusual. There are not many women who are mentioned in many places in rabbinic literature, but she is mentioned in Mishnah Yevamot, Sifrei Dvarim, Sifra, Tosefta, Psikta, Echa Rabbah and Yerushalmi that I listed on the page, as well as the Babylonian Talmud. The sources are on page 2 if you're interested in the sources, in my handwriting, which is Golinkin font 14. So here we have a woman from the late Second Temple period who is mentioned in many places in rabbinic literature. And the most famous story is the one that I Xerox for you from Gittin Folio 56A, which is page number 4. I Xerox from Rabbi Steinsaltz's edition because it has vowels, it has nikud. And if you want to look at a partial English translation, it's on page 5 from an article by Professor Burton Vysotsky. For some reason, he decided not to translate the whole passage, even though the end is also important. So first I'm going to read the version from the Babylonian Talmud, and then I'm going to read the version from Midrash Hagadol, which from a literary point of view is much better. So I'm on page 4 in the Hebrew, and you can follow in the English on page 5, and I should emphasize that the Hebrew is not Hebrew, it's Aramaic. So in page 4, it's paragraph Gimel. Martha bat Baitus, Atirta d'Yerushalayim Havya, she was a rich woman of Jerusalem. And the context of this passage in Gittin, which I frequently teach on Tisha B'Av, is a few dozen stories about the destruction of the Second Temple and the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And in the Babylonian Talmud, Gittin folios 55b to 58a are the largest kovets, the largest group of stories about the destruction of the Second Temple. So in the middle of that lengthy list, compilation of stories, is this story. So she is a witch woman of Jerusalem, and you'll see immediately, and that's the context here, that we're in the middle of the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans, so we're close to the year 70 of the Common Era, or in the year 70 of the Common Era. Shedarta leshlucha ve'amra le. She sent for her messenger boy, her servant, and says to him, Zil aiteli smida, go and bring me solet. Solet is fine flour. Okay. Smida is a Greek word. Ad azal, until he went to the shuk to buy the fine flour, izdaban, it was all sold. Ata marla, smida leka, chivarta ika. He says there's no fine flour, but there is white flour. And unfortunately, even though this is a very serious story, it comes across as the Keystone Cops. Right? She keeps sending out the shaliach. He keeps coming back and saying, sorry, they're sold out. Comes back again, goes out again. Sorry, they're sold out. Amrale, she says to him, Zil aiteli, go and buy me white flour. Adazal izdaban, until he gets to the shuk, it's sold. Atava Amarla, he comes and says to her, Chivarta leka, there's no white flour. Gushkera ika, Gushkara, Steinsaltz translates as subin, which is bran, but I think that Vysotsky's translation is better, coarse flour. It's a simpler type of flour. So in other words, instead of simply buying the more simple flour, he comes back and tells her, well, there isn't A, there's B. There isn't B, there's C. Amrale zilaitele, bring me the coarse flour. Adazali zvaban, until he gets to the store, it's gone. Atava amarla gushkera leka, there is no coarse flour. Kim chadesare ika, there is barley flour. Amrale zilaitele, go and buy it. Adazali zdaban, until he goes to the store, it's gone. So at this point, she's already miyueshet, she's already given up on her stupid servant. Hava shlifa mesana, she takes off her shoe, and it's not clear why she takes off her shoe in order to go out into the street. Amara, she said, Epuk ve'echazei imashkachna mide lemechal. I will go out and see if I can find something to eat. Etiv la parta bechara umeta. Parta in Hebrew is parash. Parash means feces. So she goes out barefoot into the street to buy anything, and a piece of feces touches her foot, and she is so shocked by this that she dies on the spot. In other words, this is such a wealthy woman. As you can see from the beginning of the story, she never goes to the store herself, right? She's like Mrs. Rothschild or the Queen of England. When was the last time the Queen of England went into a makolet to buy something, right? She's never been to a makolet to buy something. Her entire life, her servants have bought food for her. So this woman is fabulously wealthy. She gave up on her servant. She takes off her shoes to go to the store to buy something. She steps on a piece of feces, parta, and she dies on the spot out of shock. Kare ale Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai reads about her this verse, states about her this verse. This is a common thing in the Talmud or in the Midrash. Something happens, and one of the sages quotes a verse and says, this story comes to illustrate this verse. And the verse is from the Tochacha, from the words of rebuke at the end of the book of Dvarim, chapter 28. Haraka becha ve'anuga asher lo nista kaf ragla. The full verse is, Haraka becha ve'anuga asher lo nista kaf ragla, hatzeg ala aretz mehitaneg umeroch, which Vysotsky translates, the most tender and delicately bred woman among you who would not venture to set the sole of her foot upon the ground. In other words, the Tochacha, the rebuke at the end of Dvarim, is saying that all these terrible things are going to happen to the Jewish people, including to the most spoiled of women who never actually sets her foot upon the ground. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says that this, what happened to Marta bat Baitus, is exactly what the Tochacha said would happen when God is angry at the Jewish people. In other words, that this spoiled woman who has never set foot or never had her feet touch the ground, she has her feet touch the ground and she dies on the spot out of shock because she touched something very dirty. And then there's a parenthetic addition of that it wasn't that she stepped on kaki, but that she stepped on something else. We'll skip that due to lack of time. I'll skip to the last 3 lines in the Hebrew story. And this Professor Vysotsky did not translate. Ki hava kai naicha nafshe, as her soul is departing her, as she is dying. Apikta lechol dahava v'chaspa, she takes all of her gold and silver. Shedite beshuka, and she throws it out on the street. Amara, and she says, Hai lemai mi baile. This, what good is it? And what good is the gold and silver? I have nothing to eat. I'm dying of hunger. Right? So she throws her gold and silver out in the street. Hainu diktiv, a verse from Ezekiel. Kaspam bachutzot yashlichu, they will throw their silver into the street. Lo yuchal lahatzilem biyom evrat Hashem, that's the end of the verse. They will not save them in the day of God's wrath. Nafsham lo yisabeu umehem lo yimalu. This will not give food to their souls, and their bellies will not be filled up. In other words, you can't eat silver. If you're dying of hunger, you're dying of hunger, and the fact that you have beautiful gold and silver is not going to save you. That's what Ezekiel says. And again, the Talmud is saying, this is what happened to Marta bat Baitus. What good did it do that her house was full of gold and silver? There was no food for her to buy because they were under siege by the Romans, and she basically died of hunger. Now let's look at the second version of the story. And the scholar who published this article, Matthew Morgenstern, I don't know him, he thinks that this is the more original version of this story in the Babylonian Talmud. It's on page, I guess, what is it? 6? The number got covered up by the staple. Okay? This story from the Babylonian Talmud was copied into a book that's called Midrash Hagadol. Midrash Hagadol was edited in Yemen, in Teman, in the 13th or 14th century. And even though it's a relatively late book, it's from the medieval period, the Temanim were very, very conservative about the transmission of rabbinic texts. In other words, the best manuscripts of the Babylonian Talmud are the manuscripts from Yemen. So if Midrash Hagadol copies this story, which is considerably different than the story we just read in the Babylonian Talmud, Morgenstern thinks that this is the original version of the story. I cannot tell you if that is true. What is clear is that from a literary point of view, this version of the story is much better. So he has here the Aramaic plus his translation. You can look at the translation if you like. Marta Kosit, which is a corruption of Beitus. Marta, the daughter of Beitus. Chashivta di Yerushalayim Havai. She was the important woman of Jerusalem. Notice it doesn't say she was a rich woman of Jerusalem. She was an important woman of Jerusalem. Amra leile shlichei. She said to her servant, to her messenger boy. And now there are 3 pairs of sentences. Zil aitili smida min shuka. Go bring me fine flour. Not fine flour? Is that the way you say it? Yeah. Fine flour from the shuk, from the street, from the marketplace. Amar la, he says to her, Smida la ika laho chivrata ika. He says, there is no fine flour, there is white flour. She says, Zil aite chivarta. Go bring me white flour. He says, La ika, there is not. There is only gushkara, which is a variant of gushkara that we saw in the other text. Coarse flour. Zil aite li gushkara. Go bring me coarse flour. La ika, disare ika. There is no coarse flour. The only thing left is barley. Zil aite li. Go bring it to me. Nefak vela ashkach vela midam. He goes out and he finds nothing. Amra, she says, Eze is a shortened version of Ezel, I will go. Eze ivaki, let me go and search. Dilma mashkach anapurta de midam achelna. Whether I will find a little bit of something to eat, right? Purta in Aramaic is a little bit. Midam is something, right? If I can find a little bit of something to eat. Etiva la purta bechara ushchiva. So she goes out. Notice in this version she doesn't take off her shoes. She's simply going out to the store. And purta gets into her or touches her foot and she dies. And you'll notice the name of this article by Matthew Morgenstern. The name of the article at the top of the page is A Rather Risque Pun in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. He says the key point of this story that's missing in the Babylonian Talmud manuscripts is the pun. There is a pun here between the word purta and purta. The first purta means a little bit, a very common word in Aramaic. The second purta is the way that Yemenite Jews pronounce the word parta. Parta is feces. Okay? Purta, parta. And what was her name? Marta. It's not a joke. That's the point here. In other words, Marta was looking for purta, but instead of getting purta, she stepped on parta. Okay? So from a literary point of view, there is no question that the Midrash Hagadol version of this story is much, much better. Right? So she goes out to look for purta, she steps on parta, and she dies on the spot. Karei alei Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, haraka b'chava anuga, the same verse from Deuteronomy, that she died from shock, having stepped on the feces, and she had never set foot on the ground before because her servants did all her shopping. To strengthen this idea that this woman was a very spoiled woman who never stepped on the ground, there is the Echa Rabbah version, which I purposely did not Xerox for you, the Lamentations Rabbah version of this story, which is a very different version. But I just want to cite one detail from that version about Marta bat Baitus, who married Yoshua ben Gamla, who was a high priest, and she wants to go see him working or worshiping in the temple on Yom Kippur. So how does she get from her house to the temple, according to Echa Rabbah? Heitziu la tapetaot mi petach beta va'ad petach bet hamikdash. They laid carpets down on the ground from her house all the way to the temple. Right? This is not a woman who's allowed to walk on the ground, right? So they actually put out carpets from her house all the way to the temple so she can go watch her husband performing whatever rituals he's doing on Yom Kippurim in the temple. It says, Kidei shelo nityachafu ragleha, in order that her feet should not be bare. Right? So this emphasizes the Echa Rabbah version of the story, emphasizes what is also in these other two versions that we studied, that this was an extremely wealthy, extremely spoiled woman, had never done her own shopping. Here her shlemiel of a servant doesn't buy her anything to eat. By the time he goes back, each time there's nothing left. And finally, she's forced to go out of her house either barefoot or not barefoot. She steps on the feces and dies of shock. Did this actually happen? I doubt it. This story is what's called an etiological story. In other words, the story comes to explain the verse from Deuteronomy. Right? The Deuteronomy says that if you don't listen to God, this is what's going to happen to you. And haraka becha va'anuga asher lo nista kaf ragla, and the most spoiled woman whose foot has never touched the ground, such and such is going to happen to her. Right? So it seems to me the story was invented in order to illustrate the fact that the terrible things in Deuteronomy chapter 28 actually happened to us at the end of the Second Temple period, with the terrible things that went on in Jerusalem during the destruction of the Second Temple. But Marta bat Baitus was a historical figure. As I said, she appears in many, many rabbinic texts. She was very wealthy. In other words, the general details of this story are absolutely accurate. The literary quality of the story seems to indicate that a lot of the specific story was exaggerated or made up. But in terms of what was going on in the city of Jerusalem in the year 70, and her own personal biography, the details fit. Yes.
That's what I wanted to say. That the general social picture at the end of the Beit Sheni, the Sinat Chinam, this was typical of what people would have thought happened.
Right. Right. You have the very wealthy class, who's the high priest and the people running the city, the Biryonim, the Sikari, the young hotheads who want to kill all the Romans and burn all of the food in the city, both according to Josephus and according to the Talmud. In other words, the whole general atmosphere is definitely correct. You have a sense, though, that especially in the second version that we read, that the literary aspect here overtook some of the facts because they were trying to tell not only a story, but an interesting story. So this is a woman of Jerusalem, Marta bat Baitus, who is an historical figure. She actually lived. We know a lot about her wealth at that time, and even though it's a depressing story, it certainly fits in with this time of year as we approach Shiva Asar B'Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, and the commemoration of the destruction of the first and second temples. The third woman, and again, I don't know when we're supposed to end. Does anyone know?
About 1, 10 to 12.
Oh, we have time. Okay.
They said 10 to 1, but then they said they delayed everything 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. So we have plenty of time. Okay. So I should have slowed down. Okay.
You can say more about the more modern.
Okay. So I chose two modern women of Jerusalem. First of all, because neither of them is well known. And second of all, because I cannot think of a greater contrast between these two women vis-a-vis modern Jerusalem and modern Zionist history. Rivka Lipa represents the Yishuv HaYashan, the old settlement, so-called old settlement of Jerusalem, who were the Haredim who lived here. Large groups of them started to make Aliyah in 1836, 1837. The students of the Gaon of Vilna, the so-called Prushim, or separated ones. Those are the ones who, until today, if you go to Mea Sharim, the ones who wear the gold kaftans, they are descendants of the original Prushim, who made Aliyah some 200 years ago. The Yeshuva Yashan, the old settlement who lived in Jerusalem, many of them did not work for a living. They lived off of chalukah. They probably called it chalukah. I don't know what they called it. But the chalukah was the money sent from Europe to support them. We're going to see that the chalukah plays an important role in this booklet. And Rivka Lipa, even though she's a woman, is a typical constituent of this group of the Yeshuva Yashan living off of Chalukah. We will see that she is a very devout woman, talks a lot about the observance of the mitzvot, talks a lot about the Mashiach, talks a lot about visiting the holy sites, whether it's the Kotel or Hebron, Marat HaMachpelah. In other words, she's not just a person, but she's really representative of a type. I published an article about Rivka Lipa in this book, Inside Israel, Volume 2, but she is certainly not a well-known figure. And I would like to tell you how I learned about Rivka Lipa, and I would like to dedicate this part of my remarks to the memory of my teacher in the course that I learned about this. In 1975, I took a course at Hebrew University with Dr. Yoram Yakovson of blessed memory, who just passed away a few weeks ago, and this is dedicated to his memory. The name of the course was Sifrut HaTzavaot, the ethical will literature, Hebrew ethical wills. There's an entire genre of Hebrew literature that is called ethical wills. The scholar that really made this famous was Israel Abrahams, but the scholar who made it famous before him was none other than Solomon Schechter. Solomon Schechter published an article called The Wills of Rabbi Judah, son of Rosh, and his brother Rabbi Yaakov Balaturim in Hebrew in 1885. Schechter was one of the first to point out that this is an entire branch of medieval Hebrew literature. Israel Abrahams published a wonderful book, which I recommend that you buy if it's in print. It's called Hebrew Ethical Wills, published in Philadelphia in 1926. It was reprinted 50 years later, and it's a bilingual edition. In other words, he has all the wills in Hebrew, and on the facing page he has an English translation. This was a custom that began in the 11th or 12th centuries, in which a Jew, not necessarily an elderly Jew, would write an ethical will to his children, to his descendants, telling them how they should behave. And there's normally, when we hear the word will, we think about, well, this table goes to Yankel, and the chair goes to Sarah, and the books go to Ruvain, and the car goes to Shimon. That's the way we view. Sorry, Edka, that you missed your section. This is Dr. Edka Leibowitz, whom I quoted from before, about the Shlam Tzion Hamalka, Queen Alexandra. So this is an entire literary form of Hebrew ethical wills that began in the 11th or 12th century. And what Israel Abrahams did in 1926, which is not surprising, is he chose some 10 or 12 famous ethical wills by rabbis, by men, and he published them with his translation and introduction. It's a very interesting collection. At the end of the semester, Dr. Yakovson gave us an assignment that we have to write I had to write 2 papers about 2 ethical wills that were not in Israel Abrahams' book. And luckily, there are a number of scholars who printed lists of Hebrew ethical wills, and altogether they listed 225 Hebrew ethical wills that had been published. And this was until, I guess, the 1930s, 1940s, when they published their bibliographies. The first bibliography is from 1935. which lists 180 Hebrew ethical wills, and then 2 other scholars added on to those lists. So what did I do? I wanted to write a paper about a woman who wrote a Hebrew ethical will. Well, out of those 225 Hebrew ethical wills, there were only 7 written by women. And one of them is the title page of the book that you have in front of you by Rivka Lipa. And I don't remember exactly why I chose it, but I have a feeling that one of the reasons that I chose it is because it was published in Hebrew and Yiddish. On every page, you have her Yiddish that she wrote, and at the top of the page, a Hebrew translation that somebody else did for her. She doesn't say whom. And she explicitly says that she doesn't know how to speak Hebrew. But she wanted this to be read not just by women, but also by scholars, and have a more serious atmosphere about it. And Yiddish was for Amcha, and Hebrew was for rabbis and scholars, so she had to publish this in Hebrew and Yiddish at the same time. By the way, the Hebrew and Yiddish are not identical, which is very, very common. Books that are published simultaneously in Hebrew and Yiddish are almost never the same. Okay? The Hebrew version is much shorter than the Yiddish version. Usually it's the other way around, that when they translate something from Hebrew into Yiddish, they expand it. And the Yiddish expression is verbessert und verteidigt, which means translated and improved. Right? And the famous joke in Yiddish is, if you buy a Hebrew edition of Shakespeare, it says on the title page, it says Macbeth von William Shakespeare, verbessert und verteidigt, translated and improved. Because obviously the Yiddish translator can do better than Shakespeare did, so he adds all sorts of things that Shakespeare didn't say. Right? But in this case, it's the other way around. The original is in Yiddish, and the Hebrew is a shortened version of the Yiddish. So I'm going to quote a few passages in Yiddish because I like Yiddish. So the woman's name was Rivka Lipa Anikster, which you can see on the title page that I Xeroxed for you. I didn't Xerox from the actual book because there's so many passages I liked, I just couldn't do it. So it says that it's by Kuntra Zecher Olam, V'hu Michtav, that it's a letter, sort of a letter, by Rivka Lipa, the daughter of Moshe Mishaluria. She was the daughter of Moshe Mishaluria, and Moshe Mishaluria was a descendant of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Ari. And she is the widow of Meir Anikster, Almanat Meir Anikster. And it says here below the picture, Yatzala Or Pam Shlishit, that this was published for the 3rd time by her daughter, Rachel Anikster, in Jerusalem in 1911. But it's really the 4th edition. There were 3 editions published when Rivka Lipa was alive, in 1882, in 1884, and in 1891. And what's fascinating is that in each version, she published the previous version, and then she added a section at the beginning. Right? So you have the original letter or ethical will, and then the additional pages at the beginning, and then the additional pages at the beginning. So I think that there are 6 different things that we can learn in general, that we can learn from this ethical will by Rivka Lipa, who is a woman of Jerusalem in the 19th century. First of all, this is a classical example of a Hebrew ethical will, even though it was written by a woman writing in Yiddish. She quotes 20 sources from the Bible and Talmud. So how does a woman who doesn't know Hebrew know all of these biblical and rabbinic sources? Can anybody tell me? Where would she have gotten them from? I heard somebody say it. Senorena. Okay. If you don't know what Sena Orena is, it shows you how far we've gotten from the language called Yiddish. Sena Orena is the all-time bestseller of Yiddish literature. There are hundreds of editions of Sena Orena. Sena Orena is sort of a running midrash on the weekly portion. I'm not sure that we know who wrote it. It was probably written by a man. And in Sena Orena, the author weaves in on every weekly portion dozens, if not hundreds, of rabbinic sources. Right? So a woman who didn't know how to read Hebrew, if she studied Sena Arena every Shabbat, which she did, she was a very learned woman because she knew all of these hundreds of midrashim or verses that are quoted in Sena Arena. So even if she just knew that one book, she was already very well versed in classical rabbinic sources. They printed Sena Arena every week. Yeah, okay. Oh, she read it from the newspaper. Okay. But she could have easily gone to the local Jewish bookstore and bought Sena Arena, right? Right. I have an edition of Sena Arena on my shelf, which is about 100 years old. But yeah, well, before the Holocaust, they were a dime a dozen. I mean, you could buy Sena Arena anywhere. Yes.
Excuse my ignorance here, but I don't know if that's in Hebrew or 2 words.
It's 2 words. Se'ena ure'ena, right? Sena ure'ena benot Zion. It's a verse from Shir HaShirim, from the Song of Songs, right? So it's saying, go out and see the daughters of Zion. Go out and see what? All of this Jewish knowledge. So I'm not going to quote you the 20 sources that she quotes, but you can see from all the different quotations, both biblical verses and midrashim, that she's very well versed in Judaism, even though she says that she doesn't speak Hebrew and she doesn't write Hebrew. She tells us basically that she made Aliyah for religious reasons. Her first activity after arriving in Jerusalem was to visit the Kotel, Rachel's tomb, and Marat HaMachpelah in Hebron, and I'll get back to that in a moment. In 34 different places, in 16 different places in a booklet that is only 34 pages long, in 16 different places, she says that we should merit to see the Mashiach. Right? So that's an average of once every 2 pages. Rivka Lipa tells us that we should have the zchut, the merit to see the Messiah come. So this is the world view that she comes from. She expresses opinions about ethical issues, such as giving tzedakah, about modesty. And for her, ethical acts and ritual mitzvot are equally important. She repeatedly expresses thanks to God who did acts of mercy and truth for her during her lifetime. She also talks about zchut avot, the merit of her forefathers, her pious forefathers. And one of the interesting things that she says, and you excuse me that each time I have to page through to get it, in folio 16b, in the Hebrew version it says, Pam achat bechodesh tikra'u michtavi hanitpas ulekayem v'lishmor hakol. That once a month you should read this letter and you should do everything that it says. In other words, this is not a static document that you read once and then you put it on the shelf. This is supposed to become a guide to your life. You're supposed to read this ethical will once a month so that it should actually guide you in your activities throughout the year. So in terms of an ethical will, this is very typical of that genre of literature, even though it was written by a woman and even though it was written in Yiddish. The second thing, which is very odd to the modern reader, is that one of the main reasons that she printed this book, and she printed it 3 times, was in order to raise money from her relatives abroad. Now, why did she want to raise money from her relatives abroad? She wanted to raise money in order to publish the manuscripts of Chidushei Torah written by her father and her brothers. In other words, they had left rabbinic works that they had written in manuscript. She felt a duty and obligation to publish those works. She, obviously living off of Chalukah in the land of Israel, did not have the money to do so. She's printing this book to distribute back both in the old country, in Europe, and in America, as we'll see in a moment, as a fundraising method. Right? Today we use crowdsourcing in Google. This is crowdsourcing, right? You print up a book, you distribute it. In the book, you ask people to send you money in order to print other books. And she emphasizes this in all 3 editions of her work. excuse me for the paging through here. 18, 1b to 2a. Right, she says here that she wants to print the works of her brother Hagaon, who died in 1885, and of her husband Hagaon, Meir Anixter, who also died in 1885, etc., etc., and my other brother, who died in 1886. In other words, I am printing this booklet and distributing it so that people will give me contributions in order to print the works of my deceased relatives. She also, we're now on item number 3, she requests in the book tzedakah for herself and for all the needy of Jerusalem. And here there's a phrase that I want to read from the original because it is a fantastic phrase, especially for someone like me who is engaged in fundraising a lot. It says here, and I didn't look for this in the Yiddish, it says here in the Hebrew, Ma rav hasimcha asher chayav lismoach kol ish haba lYerushalayim im tzror kaspo. How much a person should rejoice, every person who comes to Jerusalem with his bundle of money. In other words, she wants people to give tzedakah to the poor people of Jerusalem, and Baruch Hashem, in the 19th century, there were plenty of poor people in Jerusalem. So this is a third reason for her publishing this book. The fourth reason is, again, very odd in the eyes of a modern reader. This is a means of correspondence with her relatives. It's a means of correspondence with her relatives in Europe, and it's a means of correspondence with her relatives in America, whom she has no way of corresponding with. She thanks the relatives in Europe for their letters, and she urges them to write more letters with news of her native shtetl, which was called Krakinova, not Anatevka, but Krakinova. And by the way, I did discover where Krakinova is. It's north of Kovno and southwest of Ponevezh, in Lithuania. Folio 3A and 13B. Right, she talks about here about her relatives in Krakinova. V'samchu et libi hachalusha b'michtevehem hatovim v'aniimim. They should make my weak heart rejoice in their lovely and good letters. So this is another motive for writing or publishing this booklet. She also talks about that this is a missive to her relatives in America, whom she has lost touch with. Since I don't know how to write to you, i.e., she doesn't know their addresses. So she thinks that eventually this book will end up in America. Her relatives will walk into the local Jewish bookstore, buy the book and say, it's Rivka Lipa, and they'll write her a letter right away. Was this an effective means of communication? I don't know. But that is what she says in the booklet, that she also wants to communicate with her long-lost relatives in America. Number 5. It is also a biography of her family and an autobiography as well. And this passage I want to read to you in the Yiddish. It's from Folio 5A. As in Krakinova bin ich 18 Jahre gewesen a Kremeker, Baruch Hashem auf Kama Alofim, und in Kaidan übergehandelt, und Hashem Yisbarach mit sein Hilf hat mir geholfen und allemen Baruch Hashem bezahlt. Which means that for 18 years I owned a store in Krakinova, and Baruch Hashem, I earned thousands, I don't know thousands of what, rubles or whatever the local currency was. And in Kaidan, I übergehandelt. I also ran trade in Kaidan, which apparently was a larger city. And God helped me that I was able to pay everything, and so on and so forth. The Hebrew translation is, Asher bioti bekrakinova mechazeket chanut v'la alafim ala mischari asher lakachti schora ba'ir Kaidan behakafa, that she took it on credit. So we see here, we learn this biographical or autobiographical detail, that she was a successful businesswoman in Krakinova. She goes on to say that her father, Reb Moshe Meshel Luria, was a descendant of the Ari and was a rabbi in Krakinova for 50 years. Her father and mother were buried in Krakinova, and this is very touching. I want to read this to you in the original as well. So she says that her father and mother are buried in Krakinova, which is not surprising. The next sentence is surprising. Und unsere 7 Fegelach, 3 sind mit 4 Mädelach, was Hashem Yisbarach hat zu sie zu genommen Bitzror Achayim, und durch sehr Schus haben wir solche gewähnt zu kommen in der heilige Stadt Jerusalem. She buried 7 children in Krakinova. 3 sons and 4 daughters. Now, it was very common in Eastern Europe for people to lose children at a young age. My grandmother, Esther Lieder, of blessed memory, Esther Lieder Proberg, of blessed memory, who was born in 1896, she was one of 12 children in Galicia, and one of her siblings died as an infant. That was very common. But 7 in one family, I think that was an unusual occurrence. And she tells us that both her parents and her 7 Eifelach, her 7 little birds, were buried in Krakinova. And she describes 5 of her brothers, 3 of whom were learned rabbis. She goes on to say that she made Aliyah in 1862, which is 20 years before she published the first edition of this ethical will. Her husband, Meir Anixter, was appointed head of the Vilna and Zamut Kollel and other charities. These are the way that the Jews in the old Yishuv lived at the time. You had to be attached to a tzedakah fund. The tzedakah fund went by a name, Vilna, Zamut, various towns or places in Eastern Europe. And her husband died in 1885. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, her book, Zecher Olam, contains a travelogue of her visits to the holy cities and the graves of the Tanaim, of the rabbis of the Mishnah, in 1862 and 1867. As far as I know, it's one of the few such travelogues written by a pious Jewish woman in the 19th century. She says that her journey to Jerusalem was as difficult as the binding of Isaac, as Akedat Yitzchak. She traveled from Krakinova to Slonim, from Slonim to Ruzhin, from Ruzhin to Karlin, from Karlin to Odessa. And Odessa, she set sail for Israel, which was very common at the time. They landed in Jaffa. They traveled to Jerusalem in joy, where they went immediately to the Kotel. The next day, they went to the Mount of Olives, Har HaZeitim, which is also a holy site, and to Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem, and to Hebron, where they visited the cave of Machpelah 3 times. 5 years later, in 1867, she traveled to Tzfat, to Safed, to visit the grave, quote, of our relative, the holy Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, and his son Moshe Luria. In other words, her father was named for that, Moshe Luria. And the Beit Yosef, she visited the grave of Rabbi Yosef Karo, and the graves of the prophets and the Tanaim. As you know, if you've ever taken an in-depth trip in the Galilee, every 10 meters you run into the grave of somebody else, most of which apparently are not the graves of those people, but Nish Keferlach, Lo Chashuv. They visited the grave of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, Shammai, Hillel, Rabbi Yochanan HaSandlar, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Eli, and more. And then I want to conclude with one fantastic quote, which is towards the end of the booklet, on folio 15b. Ich bin nur gekommen zurück kein Tzfat. I had just come back to Tzfat. Azai bin ich wieder krank geworden, Rahman al-Islam, that I became sick again. Haben dorten die idische Doktorim, the Jewish doctors said, gesagt, as azoi a schlafe wie ich, bin ken reiten auf ein Esel auf die alle Berg, azoi wellen alle Teute im Yirza Hashem lebendig werden. Which I translated as follows. And then we returned to Tzfat, and the Jewish doctor said that if a weak person such as me can ride on a donkey over all the mountains, then all the dead can, God willing, live again. And they told me to travel to Tiberias to bathe in the hot springs. Right, so she had a sense of humor too, or at least the doctors in Tzfat had a sense of humor. We can see here just how much Rivka Lippert represents the Yishuv Yashan, the old Yishuv of Jerusalem, living off of Chalukah, visiting the holy sites, talking about the coming of the Messiah constantly. In other words, she is very much a representative of her generation of Jerusalemites, both men and women, in the late 19th century. I would like to conclude to Rivka Lippa's exact opposite, which was Esther Tselingold, Zichrona Livracha. I reread this book yesterday, and it's hard to read this book without crying. Esther Tselingold was born and raised in England. Professor Shalvi knew her personally. Esther Tselingold made Aliyah in 1947. Professor Shalvi made Aliyah in 1949. They attended the same Zionist youth groups in England. And so on and so forth. And Esther Tselingold died defending the city of Jerusalem in May of 1948, a month before her 23rd birthday. And luckily for us, after moving to Israel in 1947, she wrote hundreds of letters to her family back in England. And her brother did a great mitzvah. This book appeared in the year 2000. I highly recommend this book. It's called An Unlikely Heroine, Esther Tselingold's Fight for Jerusalem, written by her brother Asher Tselingold with a foreword by Yitzchak Navon. It's the very last page is her last letter, which we'll get to in a moment. And I'm primarily going to quote from her letters. In other words, Asher Tselingold adds a lot of additional material, letters written by other people, historical documents. He fills in the historical background. In other words, he's telling you exactly what was going on in Israel and in Jerusalem as she was writing these various letters. But as in the case of Rivka Lippa, I think it's much more interesting to hear what the person themselves had to say. And thank God her family saved these letters. And I will quote as many as I can until our time runs out, and then we will conclude with her final letter. So she comes to Jerusalem, and what was her excuse for getting an entry permit from the British? She became a teacher at the Evelina de Rothschild School in Jerusalem, which was a famous school even then. As you know, it was founded 150 years ago. And by the way, the book review I read of this book originally was written by Dr. Beverly Grivitz, who was the headmaster of Evelina de Rothschild. So when she comes to Jerusalem, she says, we came to Jerusalem on a Sunday morning. I was in the school right away. I started teaching on Wednesday. The Palestinian children, the Sabras, are just bursting with vitality and bumptiousness, so that they need disciplining to some extent. The very real problem is to get these kids ever to shut up and give you a chance to teach them something. That's in 1947. Well, nothing has changed. She says in a letter on the next page that she realizes that she's describing Israel and Jerusalem through rose-colored lenses. I had not consciously made up my mind from the first moment to love it all. All of it, I say frankly, is biased, seen by me through rose-colored spectacles. But I am happy, so very happy, that I can see that at only rare intervals had I ever known before what happiness means, certainly not as a continuous state of mind and being as it is with me now. And this is her attitude towards Israel and Jerusalem in many of her letters. She also describes the city of Jerusalem physically, both what's going on with the English soldiers and the barbed wire, the Jewish agency headquarters, the Mea Sha'arim. Here one sees what peyot really mean, and strimals and silk bekishes, even on the little boys. Only when I look at the great ancient hills among which Jerusalem stands, which sweep down in ridge after ridge of neatly terraced stone, nothing but brown sand and bleak white stone, that I see what it meant to establish colonies on the peaks of these hills, as is being done continuously. How they ever got up there or got down again, I cannot imagine. She has a lot of criticism for the British in her various letters. I'll just read one of these passages. We had a mild winter, and she's talking about the English national crisis. I don't know exactly what was going on in England at that time. I see now that it is perfectly true that the tolerant, well-mannered Englishman is quite a different person abroad, where he thinks himself the master of inferior foreigners and subjects who have to be subdued and ruled. For them, democratic principles and decency do not have to be applied. And she has a lot of criticism of the British in her various letters. She tells us on page 71 that Jerusalem is a very small town. On March 16th, I think this is in 47, on March 16th, martial law was lifted. She describes the euphoria. What a feeling of excitement. The kids rush through the barriers on the stroke of 12 and come to school so excited. Nobody, not even the authorities themselves, realized it would be over so suddenly, except, of course, the Jews in Mea Sha'arim, from whom I had already heard it on Shabbat, in other words, that the martial law is going to end. It must be all written down somewhere in some Kabbalah or somewhere, although it's the little children who bring all the information, and they are always right. Jerusalem is a terribly small town as regards gossip and news, but it has its good uses. If there is curfew, for instance, it is not usually officially announced, so people could get into serious trouble unwittingly. However, within 2 minutes, the news gets around town, nobody knows from where, and all are safely in the know. So just as today, news traveled around Jerusalem very quickly, she says in a number of places in her book that Jerusalem is home. Much as I have thought of coming to visit you, to go back to England in the summer, I cannot say coming home because here is my only home from the moment I arrived. I feel I owe the first real holiday to the land of Israel, to looking around this new home and really getting to know it. Then, having spent a complete year here, I shall feel that I really belong. Quite apart from the fact that I might never be able to return if I left now, and I am not going to take any risk with that. And she thinks if she visits her parents too quickly, she will stay in England and not return to home, and therefore she decided not to visit them at that time. She has a lovely description of a concert by Leonard Bernstein, which I'm not going to read. She has a lovely description of Chaim Weizmann. One of the things going on at that time was UNSCOP. UNSCOP was one of the many commissions, this one from the UN, that was trying to figure out how to divide the land of Israel. Weizmann spoke extremely well, of course, an interesting, good humor, sincere address. We really have some great men who can express themselves. The only trouble is that the others are really not interested in our case on its own merits. Gee, that sounds new. However, if they do decide to act finally, it will be partition and some kind of Jewish state. Only we won't be able to call it the Yishuv anymore, because as Weizmann said, there will be standing room only. Right? Yishuv means to sit. If you don't believe that Jews here have the will to find a way in every aspect of life, you should see the buses we travel in, usually holding 70 and built for half that number. You would be surprised how many can squeeze in, and with a little cooperation all around. Of course, as time goes on in her letters, the situation becomes more serious. She starts hinting that she's going to sign up for the Haganah. She slowly but surely becomes a full-time Haganah soldier, even though she does not tell her parents. Her parents think that she is still teaching at Evelina de Rothschild. She describes in great detail and with great excitement the UN partition vote in November of 1947. We are all very much on edge and expectant. but the final version of our fate keeps being postponed. The main trend of things seems to be pretty clear by now, which is that there's going to be a partition. She goes on to describe her exultation when the UN, after the UN vote takes place. Much as I have to write and want to write now, I am just too tired to sit anymore, so this is just to let you know that I survived the celebration. I am terribly busy now, more so than ever, but I shall find time to describe the wonderful and interesting state of affairs that accompanies something that occurs once in 2,000 years. For now, I can only write shalom, and let us all meet soon in the Jewish state. And in the next passage, she describes in detail the vote, but I'm not going to read that right now. As the beginning of 1948 dawns, January, February, she is now full-time in the Haganah. She goes to Tzuba, which is now Kibbutz Tzuba, and serves there in the Haganah. She goes to Neve Yaakov. Her brother explains that most of the women who participated in Haganah activities at these times were merely helping the men. They were cooking and doing other chores. Esther insisted on fighting herself. When the Arabs would open fire at Neve Yaakov, she would grab a gun and go shoot back. She describes friends that were killed on a number of occasions. She describes the explosion at the Palestine Post, which was one of very famous events that happened at that time. In addition to working for the Haganah, she volunteered to read on Haganah radio. She was one of the Karyaniot. She was one of the news readers in English for the Haganah. And then starting in April of 48, she says that she wants to go to the Old City. She wants to defend the Old City of Jerusalem. The Old City was already cut off from the rest of the city. You had to wait a long time to get into the Old City. The British would only allow X number of people per day. Her brother Asher says that frequently people would wait online. One day, they would see they're not going to get there and they would give up. She came back every day until she finally got into the Old City of Jerusalem. And then she became one of the fighters in the Old City of Jerusalem in May of 1948. I just want to read you a brief description of what she did there. And then I would like to read her final letter. This is someone else describing Esther. So she arrives. She was appointed to the role of sector liaison, and when the fighting began, she took care of all the outposts in her sector, bringing food and ammunition to the defenders. She moved around from one outpost to the other, encouraging our people and inquiring about their needs. She had a special kind of tranquility, dodging the shells and bullets with no sign of fear. And finally, she writes this last letter to her parents and her brother's sister, which arrived after she died. That is what I Xeroxed for you. It's the last page in your source sheet. We have had a bitter fight. I have tasted Gehinnom, but it has been worthwhile because I am convinced that the end will see a Jewish state and the realization of all our longings. I shall be only one of many who fell in sacrifice, and I was urged to write this because one in particular was killed today who meant a great deal to me. Because of the sorrow I felt, I want you to take it otherwise, to remember that we were soldiers and had the greatest and noblest cause to fight for. God is with us, I know, in his own holy city, and I am proud and ready to pay the price to make cost to reprieve it. Don't think I have taken unnecessary risks. That does not pay when manpower is short. But I did find the excitement I have always needed and have enjoyed it. I hope you may have a chance of meeting any of my co-fighters who survive, if I do not, and that you will be pleased and not sad of how they talk of me. Please, please do not be sadder than you can help. I live my life fully, if briefly, and I think that is the best way, short and sweet. Very sweet it has been here in our own land. There cannot be a bigger contrast between Rivka Lipa and Esther Selingold. One from the Yishuv Yashan, one from the Yishuv Chadash. They were both women of Jerusalem, as were Queen Alexandra and Martha Bat Baitus, Throughout Jewish history, there have been many, many women of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, we don't know most of their names. We don't know most of their stories. But I was happy that today we were able to share 4 of them. Toda rabah.